Let's talk about Genesis 26 through 30. I'm going to assume that if you were watching this video, you've been watching these videos, that you basically know where we are. And I'm just going to pick up basically exactly where we left off. It's kind of a weird angle for the camera for this video because it is too hot outside and my car actually doesn't have air conditioning. And so the phone just keeps on overheating. So we're just going to record kind of from this lower angle so the sun won't be hitting it. You gotta love, we have all this technology and we can't engineer a phone that doesn't get too hot in the sun. But picking it up in Genesis 26, we are literally continuing on exactly where the story left off. Right now, Isaac is getting older, Abraham has passed away, and the question hanging over everything is who is going to be in charge of God's covenant people in the next generation once Isaac is gone? Who's going to be the head of the family? Who's going to be leading God's covenant people into the next generation, leading God's people on the mission God has given to them to introduce the surrounding pagan nations, introduce the world to the true God who wants to redeem them and restore them? That is the big question that is hanging over all of what we are going to read in the next 5 chapters. Esau is the firstborn, so naturally he is the kind of de facto shoe-in to lead the family and the household in the next generation. And yet, last week we talked about the way that he sold his birthright for a pot of soup. Why did he do that? It's because he does not care about God's mission. He doesn't care about God's covenant. He doesn't care about the responsibilities that come with being the head of the household in God's covenant people. So when he sold his birthright to Jacob, what he's essentially doing is he is selling both the right and the responsibility to lead God's people into the next generation on God's mission. And we see that same exact thing here as we open up chapter 26. Esau continues to make a mockery of God's covenant and his mission by marrying Hittite women. Why is it a problem that he's marrying these Hittite women? It's because the Hittites are still a pagan people. They have not come to a saving knowledge of the Lord. They have not left behind the false gods of their ancestors and instead taken up the true God. They have not left behind the wickedness, injustice, and idolatry they inherited from the ancient Near Eastern pagan culture in which they were birthed. And as a result, that means that the women that Esau is marrying are going to raise Esau's children to worship pagan gods. I think we touched on this a little bit last week, but we're going to talk even more about it this week. In the culture of the ancient Near East, they very rigidly divided. Men were responsible primarily for kind of a manual physical labor. Women were responsible primarily for things that were kind of, you could say like within the home, like raising children. It still wasn't quite the same as what we tend to think of as traditional gender roles. There's really no such thing as traditional gender roles. There is, a very, very basic kind of men are biologically wired one way, women are biologically wired another way, and most cultures have kind of reflected that in the way that they've assigned roles to men versus women. But the kind of Eisenhower era gender roles that a lot of us assume are just baked into the structure of the universe are not found. They are not taught in scripture, at least not the way that we tend to think of, and they are not found consistently throughout cultures. This is kind of a digression, but we'll talk more about this later down the line. But one way that they very rigidly defined gender roles in the ancient Near Eastern culture was that women were almost entirely responsible for kind of the child rearing, which meant that whoever your wife was would have a very significant influence over your children's spiritual life. So Esau is making a choice when he marries these Hittite women. He is choosing to marry women who do not know the Lord and who will raise his children to worship false gods. Best case scenario, she will raise them to worship her false gods along with the true God. But maybe much more likely scenario, she is going to raise his children to worship her false gods instead of the true God. So he is literally spitting in the face of God's covenant. He is literally robbing the Lord of the worship of his children. And so once again, Esau is unquestionably demonstrating that he has no business leading God's covenant people into the next generation. And yet, despite the fact that the firstborn son of Isaac is radically unfaithful, and you can't blame parents for their adult children's behavior, but the sense that you get reading the Isaac, Rebekah, Esau, Jacob stories is that Isaac really did not seriously carry out his role and responsibility as the head of the household. That Esau and Jacob do not seem to have gotten the kind of guidance in the faith that children need from their fathers and their mothers. And yet, despite that, God continues to commit himself to Isaac and his family. God repeatedly, explicitly binds himself to Isaac, devotes himself to Isaac with all these same promises that he gave to Abraham. And so we get this kind of famous story where God reiterates these same covenant promises. I will be with you. I will be with your bloodline. Through your descendants, I will bless all the families, all the nations, all the peoples of earth. Essentially, you are the bloodline through which the long-promised Savior is going to come. I'm going to redeem humanity and restore the world through someone who is going to come through your bloodline, and I'm going to protect and preserve your bloodline all the way through history until that day comes. And in response to God's promise, Isaac builds an altar at a place called Beersheba, and he digs a well there at Beersheba. And when he does that, essentially what he's doing is he is expressing his continued faith. When he builds that altar, that's an act of worship. He's worshiping the Lord in response to the Lord's covenant faithfulness to him. And then when he digs that well, why do you dig a well? You dig a well because you're going to live there. You dig a well because you need a permanent water source, because you're going to permanently live there. You're going to be there for the long haul. He's saying, I'm permanently settling here in Beersheba. Beersheba is in the promised land. He's saying, I am building this well, declaring I intend to be here in the promised land for the long haul because I trust you to follow through on your promises. I'm not going to run away to Egypt like my father did when things got tough. I am going to stay right here. And we literally see that playing out right here in this chapter. A famine strikes while Isaac is the head of the covenant household, just like the famine struck when Abraham was the head of the covenant household. God warns Isaac, do not do what Abraham did. He says, do not faithlessly flee to Egypt. Don't allow your faith to waver so that you run away like a coward as if you cannot trust me to protect and preserve you like I said I would. Stay here. And so Isaac remains in the promised land. That is an act of faith. And yet, just because Isaac maintains his faith in this one place where Abraham did not, that doesn't mean he passed every test. Because here in the exact same chapter, we see Isaac repeating the same exact thing Abraham did, but this time with Rebekah. Just like Abraham went to Egypt and told everyone that Sarah was his sister, he did that because he was trying to protect Sarah and himself. He wasn't pimping Sarah out literally. I think I used that as a joke, but don't take that too literally. He is trying to protect Sarah from being just seized by someone and raped and kind of taken into their harem because she is the beautiful wife of a foreigner that they have no issue with killing. Abraham presents her as his sister so that someone will essentially say, she's beautiful. I want to bring her into my household as one of my concubines or wives or something like that. And so Sarah will be protected. He will be protected. He is trying to protect both of them. This is well-intentioned, but he's doing it in a way that has zero trust in the Lord to follow through on his promise. Isaac now does the same thing. He doesn't go to Egypt, but he once again acts like a coward. He fails to trust the Lord. He says Rebekah is his wife. He doesn't trust God to preserve them for the sake of his covenant promise and covenant mission. And yet at exactly the same time, something very fascinating happens. There, during the famine, even as Isaac is just colossally screwing up, God works through Isaac to reveal himself to the surrounding pagans once again. He demonstrates that he is with Isaac and his household. He is drawing the pagans to himself by drawing their attention to Isaac and his household. How does he do that? He does that by blessing Isaac's harvest in the middle of the famine. While everyone else is unable to grow the most basic crops, Isaac is having this abundant harvest. And so Isaac is able to bless others out of the abundance of his harvest. Isaac is able to feed others out of the abundance God has given to him. So any sincere, genuine, open-hearted, open-minded pagan there in the surrounding area should see this, and immediately it register the true God is with that man, Isaac, and his household. And yet, that is not the way so many of the pagans around him respond. We've talked about how in the culture of the ancient Near East, they were viciously anti-foreigner. Best case scenario, if you were a foreigner, they looked at you with suspicion. More realistic scenario, they looked at you with hostility. Remember, that's what was happening in Sodom and Gomorrah. They saw these two angels who came to town to meet with Lot and his family as foreigners, and they wanted to these foreigners either to death, that was often what would happen, or into just leaving quickly, or if they didn't leave quickly, it would at least send the message, hey, don't get comfortable here. You don't belong here. You are a foreigner. And so these kind of roving rape gangs like the one in Sodom and Gomorrah back in Genesis 18, that was actually the norm in the ancient Near East. That is the way they saw foreigners. That is the way they would have seen foreigners like Isaac. And so many of these ancient Near Eastern pagans around Isaac, they see the Lord blessing his harvest. They see him literally giving away the abundance of his harvest to keep others alive when theirs failed. And rather than saying, you know what, that foreigner is all right, actually, I like that guy. And obviously, something is going on with the God he worships that I need to know more about. That is the way that a righteous pagan will respond. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But that is not the way that everybody responded. Instead, so many of them responded with jealousy. They responded with disdain. They said, why is that foreigner having such an abundant harvest when we have nothing? Why is that foreigner prospering here in our land? You know, we fall into that same exact mindset. We look at like wealthy second generation immigrants and other stuff like that. You know, politicians literally get into office by saying like, oh, these foreigners are coming and they're taking your blood. And that's essentially the mindset of an ancient Near Eastern pagan. That is exactly the mindset of the people who mistreated Isaac and Abraham and Jacob and so on and so forth. We as fallen and sinful humans are extremely susceptible to this mindset. We kind of get it into our heads that in some way, if somebody from somewhere else comes here and succeeds in a way that we are not currently succeeding, that it must somehow mean that they've been cheating us or robbing us. But you know, a lot of times the issue is you will not go to work. You will not stay at a job for longer than 6 months. You will not whatever. And this dude came over here and he doesn't care. He will work for minimum wage. He will work for less than minimum wage. He will work 12 hours, 16 hours, 20 hours if he needs to in a day to take care of his family. You won't come to work if you drank too much last night. Sometimes that's exactly how simple it is. And that mindset has been around all the way since the ancient times. And so the pagans actually respond with anger and hostility at the way that the Lord has blessed Isaac's crop. And yet, not all of them, because there were sincere pagans there, righteous pagans, people like Abimelech. Now, we've talked about this. Abimelech probably was a title, not the name of a person. And so Abimelech is probably like the Abimelech, the sort of like chieftain of this tribe. He's kind of the head of this village. Abimelech sees Isaac's prosperity, and he sees it specifically as a sign from the Lord. And so he says, we need to make a treaty with Isaac. We need to covenant ourselves, Isaac. This is not quite the same as him coming to faith. This is not the same as him literally pledging himself to the Lord, but this is something. God is revealing himself to the lost through his covenant people, even when they constantly trip over themselves the way that Isaac does. That is chapter 26. But let's talk about Genesis 27. Because as we dive into Genesis 27, the story comes back around to Esau and his pagan wives. Because Esau's pagan wives have done exactly you would expect. They have done exactly what Rebekah was afraid they were going to do. They have done exactly what anybody who knows anything could have told you they were going to do. And it is a genuine threat to God's covenant people, because if more and more generations of new children are raised to worship false gods instead of the true God, or false gods alongside the true God, then it's very hard to actually carry on the covenant message, the covenant blessing. It's hard to spread the truth if you've distorted the truth. And in the same way, it creates discord in the family. If different members of the family worship different gods, we have a problem. The family is not actually following the true God together. And above all, it is this genuine threat to God's covenant mission, because God's people are sent out on mission to introduce the lost world to the true God. That is literally what Israel was about. That was the beginning, middle, and end of their purpose. They're not just some random arbitrary nation that God decided he liked better than others and made into his special little boy, so everybody has to love them and give them infinite treats and use taxpayer money to send missiles so that they can shoot at Christians in Palestine and so on and so forth. That is not what's happening with God's promise to Israel. They were a people who were given a mission. And yet Esau's pagan wives are a direct threat to that mission. But again, we have to come back to the question. Genesis 27 keeps coming back. Why did Esau end up like this to begin with? Why was it even an option on the table for Esau to take these pagan wives who quite literally threatened to derail everything that God is doing in his covenant people? It's because of Isaac and Rebekah. Genesis does not idealize Abraham, does not idealize Isaac, does not idealize Jacob, any of the characters that it follows, any of the people from history that it centers on. Genesis is straight, brutally honest about everybody involved. And it tells us in no uncertain terms, Isaac and Rebekah were colossally terrible parents. And we see this very clearly. Isaac and Rebekah constantly show favoritism to their children. Rebekah favors Jacob over Esau. Rebekah wrongs Esau through her favoritism to Jacob. Isaac favors Esau over Jacob. He is wronging Jacob through his favoritism to Esau. Each parent is neglecting one of their children, literally half of their legacy. And when they do this, they are not acting like God's covenant people. They are not living out of faith. They are being unfaithful. What they're doing is they are living like the fallen and broken world. Remember, we've talked about this. There are essentially two ways Genesis lays out for us to live. We can live like God's covenant people, live in ways that reflect God's goodness and God's glory because we are his covenant people. Or we can live like the fallen world that the Lord is rescuing us from. Isaac and Rebekah are living like Cain and his line. They are not living like Abel, a faithful son. They're living like Babel, the wicked empire that not only conquered all the people around them, but then tried to build a ladder up to heaven and conquer God himself. And as a result, they are teaching their kids to be like that too. And we see this more clearly than anywhere in the way that Isaac actively plans to disobey the Lord. Isaac literally sketches out a plan to rebel against the Lord's clear word, because the Lord clearly declared that Jacob would rule over Esau. He clearly declared that Jacob would be the torchbearer for his covenant people in the next generation. And yet Isaac says, no, I'm going to give it to Esau. Jacob literally legally purchased Esau's birthright. So Jacob is legally the firstborn now, even though he is biologically the secondborn. They made what was culturally a legitimate, valid legal trade. There was deception involved, yes, but it was still legally valid. So Isaac is essentially breaking kind of the informal law of the land by planning to give his firstborn blessing to Esau, and he is rebelling against God's clear declaration, Jacob is the one I've chosen as my torchbearer, not Esau. Isaac is preparing to give him the blessing of the firstborn. This is genuinely a problem. We need to understand Isaac is bald-faced rebelling against God by doing this. Isaac has a now God-given responsibility to give Jacob the blessing of the firstborn. And Isaac is looking God in the face and saying no. And this actually does matter. Like, this is not this is not one of those things that's just all kind of semantics. In the ancient Near Eastern culture, they saw oral blessings, like verbal blessings from fathers to son, as legally binding. They were often considered prophetic. Essentially, that the blessing given to you by your father would literally shape your future in a real way. And so in the mindset of the ancient Near East, if Isaac gives that covenant blessing to Esau, it will actually go to Esau, even if its rightful recipient is Jacob. That essentially, even though Jacob now is legally the firstborn, even though God himself has declared, Jacob will be the leader of my covenant people. In the culture of the ancient Near East, the way that they saw things was that if Isaac gives that firstborn blessing to Esau, he essentially becomes the firstborn again. He essentially is overriding Jacob's legal claim to the firstborn birthright. And so essentially the big tension that's happening here in this chapter is that they must find a way to stop Isaac's sin. That is what's happening. Isaac is sinning. They must find a way to stop Isaac's sinful desire to give the firstborn blessing to Esau, to give the right and responsibility to lead God's covenant people to Esau instead of God's chosen vessel, Jacob. They have to find a way to stop Isaac from doing this. Because as we've talked about, if the faithless man, Esau, receives this covenant blessing of the firstborn, the people of God will be led into the next generation by a man who is willing to destroy all that God has done and called them to. The stakes are unbelievably high here. And yet, there's another problem, and that is that the way that Rebekah and Jacob go about stopping Isaac is also shot through with a lack of trust in the Lord. Rather than trusting the Lord to provide them a way to stop this that is honest, that reflects his goodness and his glory, like God's covenant people, they determine that they have no choice but to use ungodly means to accomplish godly goals. So their goal of stopping Isaac is godly. The method they use to do it, deceiving Isaac, is ungodly. And here's the thing, using ungodly means to accomplish godly goals is ungodliness. Using ungodly means to accomplish godly goals is faithlessness. If you convince yourself, I have to sin in order to accomplish this good goal, what you are saying is God can't truly be trusted. And that is what Rebekah and Jacob are doing. Their faith is also wavering here. And in fact, Jacob takes it about as far as you can possibly take it. Jacob does one of the worst things you can do in this process. He falsely claims God's authority in the process of this deception. He says, when he's pretending to be Esau, he says, God gave me success. Isaac says, you're back so fast from the hunt, Esau. And Jacob says, I'm back so fast because Yahweh gave me success. He is literally invoking God's name as part of his deception. I mean, politicians do this every single day. You literally cannot watch a White House press conference without seeing, our leaders falsely claiming God's name, essentially taking his authority as their own. That's what the Bible is talking about when it says taking the Lord's name in vain. Taking God's name in vain does not say shouting Jesus Christ when you stub your toe. You probably should not do that anyway, but that's not what taking the Lord's name in vain is. Taking the Lord's name in vain is falsely claiming God's authority or power, blessing, or anything like that as a way of getting other people to do what you want them to do or believe what you want them to believe. It's essentially turning God into a tool for your goals rather than giving yourself over as a tool for his goals. This is perhaps the most egregious form of sin. This is perhaps the most disrespectful thing you can do when it comes to the God of the universe. And so Jacob does not come out of this looking good either. And yet the Lord uses this to bring about his will. So the scheme plays out, it works, and as a result, the family is fractured. And this is unavoidable. And it's fractured because Rebekah and Jacob faithlessly use ungodly methods to accomplish a godly goal, but it's also fractured because Isaac set up the ungodly circumstances that got them here in the first place. And above all, because now he is an adult, he is responsible for his own actions. Esau has this wildly ungodly mindset that is radically destructive to everything that the Lord has in store for his people. Because Esau sees both the birthright of the firstborn and the blessing of the firstborn as essentially just kind of prizes that belong to him by some innate right. He sees them as participation trophies, basically. He says, I was biologically born first, therefore the blessing belongs to me. I was biologically born first, therefore the birthright of the firstborn just belongs to me. Who cares if I sold it for soup? Who cares if dad gave it to you? It belongs to me, period. He sees it as an innate right, not as a responsibility, but to be the firstborn by birthright. To be blessed as the firstborn in God's covenant people is a deep responsibility under the Lord. It is a responsibility to lead God's people in his mission. And what has happened to Esau is that he has lost his birthright and now his blessing by his own failures. And yet he sees this not as the consequences of his actions, which is what they are. He sees this as a betrayal. He sees himself as an innocent victim. And as a result, he is filled with a kind of murderous rage toward Jacob. This does not trigger any kind of self-reflection on the part of Esau. Why would it? None of the other things that led up to it would. When the Lord quite literally prophesied, I will take the birthright away from Esau and give it to Jacob, that didn't trigger any kind of reflection in Esau. He is at this point in his life a man who is incapable of reflecting on himself, incapable of taking responsibility for anything. And as a result, there is a major problem in God's covenant people. And we see it in Isaac's blessing on Jacob and then his blessing on Esau. Isaac's blessing specifically on Esau kind of prophesies, kind of predicts the strife and the conflict that's going to happen between Jacob and Esau in the short term, between some of Jacob's descendants and Esau's descendants in the long term. Eventually, the descendants of Esau will become an enemy nation against the descendants of Jacob. So they will become a nation that is constantly at war with Israel later down the line. And it's important that we not misinterpret this. This kind of prophetic blessing, which doesn't really sound like a blessing, right? He says, Esau, you're going to serve your brother. You're going to be under your brother. You're going to be under the power of your brother, and so on and so forth. And your descendants are going to fight against his descendants, and on and on and on. This is not a kind of deterministic pronouncement by the Lord. This is not just God arbitrarily saying, you have no choice. This is what's going to happen. This is your destiny. This is what was set apart for you from before you were ever even born. That is not what's happening here. This is a lament about the ongoing, long-term consequences of Isaac and Rebekah's unfaithful behavior towards their children. This is a lament of the way that Isaac and Rebekah created this massive roadblock in the way of God's covenant purpose and mission. And when Esau hears all of this, he makes a very important decision. He decides to kill Jacob out of revenge. Esau faithlessly says, to hell with God's will, to hell with God's prophecy, to hell with God's mission. I want my birthright. I want the blessing of the firstborn. And if that means I need to kill the new firstborn, then I will. Esau's entire thought process is fundamentally pagan, fundamentally ungodly. There is no covenant consciousness in Esau. And yet, Esau's violent rage cannot stop God's will. And we're going to see that as we trek into chapter 28. Let's talk about Genesis 28. Because as we open up Genesis 28, so many of these things come to a head in a really bizarre way. But I actually love this. This is one of my favorite chapters in all of Genesis. Really, maybe one of my favorite chapters in all of Scripture. It's awesome. But at exactly the same time as Esau is plotting to kill Jacob, God is promising himself Jacob. He does the same thing to Jacob here in chapter 28 that he did to Isaac in chapter 26. He explicitly promises himself to Jacob, binds himself to Jacob, just like he did with Abraham, just like he did with Isaac, all the way to repeating the core. He says, through your offspring, all the families of the earth will be blessed. He says, you are the torchbearer of my covenant now. You will lead my covenant people into the next generation now. And because that is true, he says, Jacob, do not mess around the way Isaac did. Do not mess around the way Abraham did. He says, listen, you need to make my covenant mission the center of your life. And so Isaac does what he should have done a long time ago, what he should have done to begin with. Isaac takes Jacob aside and says, you are the official covenant bearer now. Do not take pagan wives like Esau did. Now, apparently Esau overheard this or something. I don't know. It doesn't give us a whole lot of details on the specific scene. But it does tell us that Esau completely misunderstood the actual issue. Because the heart of the issue is that Esau is totally apathetic about the covenant calling that is on him and his family. That's the issue. Marrying these pagan wives was a symptom of the issue, but he thinks the symptom itself is the issue. He says, oh, they didn't want me to marry foreigners. They wanted me to marry somebody who's from our bloodline. So Esau goes, he finds Ishmael's family again. He marries someone from Ishmael's family, comes back home and says, Mom, Dad, check it out. I've got a wife who's related to us. I've got a wife who's part of our kin. He tries to please his parents by marrying one of their kin. He doesn't understand that the problem is you sold your children out to the false gods of the pagan. You literally just spat in the face of the covenant God has given us. That is the problem. You could have converted these pagan women and then married them so they would raise your children in the face, but you didn't even try. You just said, that's an attractive pagan woman. I'm going to make her my wife, and I'm going to give the keys to my children's future over to her. Isaac says, Jacob, do not do that. You are the covenant torchbearer, and that means you need to go find a wife for yourself who will raise your children to know the true God. He says, go back to where Abraham came from. Go find Abraham's kinfolk. They have at least some foundation in Yahweh worship. Just like my father did when he found Rebekah for me. You must find your wife from among the same kin. And so Jacob goes and he tracks down Rebekah's sketchy brother, Laban. But on the way back to meet Abraham's kin, something unbelievably strange happened. What happens is that God gives Jacob a vision. Now, this has been kind of a running theme, right? God gave Abraham a series of visions, like the visions when he walks through the covenant kind of sacrificial animal blood path twice. He gives him this vision that essentially says, I am going to uphold my end of the covenant, and I am going to uphold your of the covenant. If you fail to uphold your end of the covenant, I am going to take the covenant punishment on your behalf. He's essentially kind of pointing towards the cross, pointing towards his permanent, unilateral, unconditional faithfulness to his people. In the same way, God gives a very similar vision to Jacob here. And in the same way, it essentially teaches Jacob and us something very important about God. But it does it in a sort of different way. He gives Jacob a vision of a ladder to the heavenly realms. Now, why is that important? It's really simple. It's because what happened in Genesis 11? What happened in the story of the Tower of Babel? What happened was the Babylonites built a tower up to the heavenly realm. Essentially, they built a ladder to the heavenly realm. If you find the video that features Genesis 11, you can find more about that. I really break it down kind of in depth in that video. But when they build this tower to Babel, essentially a giant ladder to heaven, a giant kind of stairway up to the heavenly realms, what they're trying to do is essentially conquer the heavenly realms. They've conquered all the rest of the area around them, and so they try to conquer the final frontier. They want to conquer the realm of the gods. What Babel was doing was they were trying to force their way into God's power and God's blessing through sheer human. And as we've seen all throughout Genesis, this is kind of one of the big running themes throughout Genesis. All human faithlessness is a form of kind of the Tower of Babel. Our faithlessness is almost always us trying to force our way into God's power and God's blessing through our own will, through our own strength, our own power, our own force, rather than trusting him to provide, relying on him to make it happen. As so many of the philosophers through the years have said, essentially what we want is God's kingdom without God the King. We want heaven without the God of heaven. We want God's glory without the God who is glorious. We want God's blessing without the God of the blessing. And even God's people have fallen into that time after time after time. Abraham, and then Isaac and Esau and Jacob and Rebekah and Sarah, and on and on and on. And that includes you and me. We repeat the same folly of the Tower of Babel over and over and over again. And yet, in this vision God gives to Jacob, what happens? He sees this ladder to the heavens, just like the Tower of Babel, and yet he's not the one who built the ladder to the heavens. Instead, this ladder to the heavens was just freely given by God. Humanity, up to this point, has been trying to force our way into God's power and blessing, and yet God just sends down this ladder to Jacob and says, you can have my power and blessing for free. He says, my love is freely given. My favor is freely given. My blessing is freely given. I have freely brought you into my covenant, and I will freely give you every that is mine. You don't have to force anything. You don't have to fight anything. You don't have to cheat for anything. You don't have to manipulate and deceive. I will give you what you have been searching for your whole life, what your family's been searching for their whole lives. I will give you what all of humanity has been searching for all of history. I'm just going to give it to you. I have given you my covenant. I have given you my kingdom. I have given you my family by grace through faith. You can stop striving. You can just follow me in rest. This is one of the most beautiful moments in the entire Old Testament. And this is one of the moments that essentially explains the rest of the Old Testament. This is what God is about. This is what God is doing. This is what God wants. He wants to freely give all of his promises to us by grace through faith. Everything else, the Old Testament law, which we'll get to when we get to Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Old Testament law was about protecting these promises, not about putting barriers around these promises. The conquest, the wars that we see in Joshua and Judges in the Promised Land was not about in some way killing other people so that we could get these promises by their blood. It was about protecting and preserving these promises for all of humanity by pouring out God's judgment on the people who threatened those promises, and on and on and on. Everything is ultimately about this, God's promise, freely given by grace through faith to redeem humanity and restore the world. But then Genesis 28 ends with literally like a comic beat. It ends with a joke. It ends with a punchline. And that is that Jacob sees all this and takes completely the wrong message away from it. Jacob sees this glorious vision and does not understand it even a little. He just says, oh, this must be a really special place. This must be the gate of heaven. This must be the gate of the Lord. I didn't even know that the Lord could come here outside the promised land. This isn't God's territory. How is God even here? This must be some special place outside the territory that God is still able to kind of manifest in front of us. He says, this has got to be some kind of special divine location. So he builds a little altar there and calls it the gate of the Lord or the gate of heaven. There's a number of different ways that you can say it. Then he starts to try to bargain with God. He says, God, if you will be with me, if you will help me, if you will see me through all of this, then I'll be faithful to you. I'll be yours. Jacob still lacks understanding. He's still really shaky. He's still very immature. Unlike Esau, Jacob does care. He actually cares about the Lord and his covenant and his mission, but he still doesn't have a lot of understanding God, his covenant, and his mission, and he still doesn't have much maturity. He's a grown adult, but he's thinking about this like a child. And yet God is faithful to Jacob even with his shakiness and immaturity. He is faithful even to weak faith. He's faithful even to shaky faith. God is faithful even to your immature faith. You do not have to be a spiritual giant to receive God's faithfulness. God's faithfulness is for you. That is chapter 28. And yet as we continue on into chapter 29, we see all of these things begin to pay off in a really remarkable way. So let's talk about Genesis 29. We just talked about the fact that Jacob is astonishingly immature. His faith is weak, shaky, and unbelievably immature. And we get a beautiful glimpse of his immaturity in chapter 29. Jacob's immaturity comes out really clearly in his impulsiveness. We see his immaturity in the fact that he just doesn't really think. We think of Jacob as a schemer, and he is, but that doesn't mean he's good at it all the time. And that doesn't mean that he is always kind of manipulating. That doesn't mean that he's always one step ahead of everybody. Being a schemer does not mean that you are a smart schemer. Most of the people who are in jail for, scheming, espionage, other stuff are actually unbelievably stupid. And we kind of see an example of this here. When Jacob arrives in the land of his kin and he lays eyes on Rachel, he is immediately in love. My wife and I were not necessarily love at first sight, but it was definitely, I thought she was insanely hot at first sight. She was just extremely my type immediately. I was dating somebody else, so, it didn't become anything. I didn't go after her or anything like that. We were just friends, but it took 0.032 seconds to be like, oh, okay, all right. Anyways, focus on class, but Jacob, it is love at first sight. And he is so overtaken with his infatuation with Rachel that he immediately wants to impress her. There's a bunch of guys waiting around the well. It's still covered. The well cover is really heavy. It's really hard to move those ancient well covers. And so you need a whole team of men. And they're waiting until enough men get there that they can do it. They need at least a handful more men, it seems like. But Jacob just says, guys, move out of the way. And he just tries to push the well cover off of the well all on his own. And he does succeed, but I'd be willing to bet he hurt himself in the process. The text doesn't say it. We don't know. Generally speaking, when you tried to move a well cover like this all on your own, it did not go well for you. But so he does something unbelievably dangerous, impulsively, without thinking, because there is a cute girl by the well. And he's like, okay, I have got to make a good first impression. I got to show her that I am strong. So he foolishly tries to move the well cover on his own. And then he has this massive emotional outburst. He literally just kind of falls onto Rachel and starts kissing her. Now, that is a problem because in the ancient Near East, you could not just start kissing someone. I mean, actually, you also just should not start kissing someone you don't even know. Today, in general, there's laws and stuff like that, but it was actually even more intense at that point in time. It was not about bodily autonomy or anything like that at that point in time. It was about the fact that he did not have a marital contract with Rachel's family. And if you didn't have a marital contract with a woman's family, you were not allowed to kiss her. You weren't even really supposed to touch her in any way, shape, or form. So Jacob has just put his own life in danger actually 2 times. First, by trying to move a well cover that it takes a team of men to move, and then by just throwing himself onto Rachel when he does not have a marital contract with her family. We have no idea how Rachel felt about all this. I mean, I guess she must have liked him at least well enough, but the big thing here is that her family has literally now been wronged by what he has done. He's fortunate that she didn't narc on him, apparently. But so they go back to her home and he meets his relative Laban. And Laban is Laban. We've already met Laban when Abraham's servant was looking for a wife for Isaac. And Laban was a scoundrel then, and Laban is, it seems, even more of a scoundrel now. Laban remembers that Abraham was a wealthy and powerful and divinely blessed member of the extended family. He was a wealthy, powerful, divinely blessed kinfolk to them. And just like all those years ago, he says, I'm going to milk this for everything it's worth. So when Jacob expresses interest in marrying his daughter, Rachel, rather than doing a standard marital contract, this was a common thing. Instead, what Laban does is he sets insane terms. And I mean insane terms. These are unheard of terms. No one bride is worth the terms that Laban sets. I don't mean that as like an insult. I mean, at that point in time, in the culture of the ancient Near East, no one in their right mind would ever accept terms like these. You would negotiate down to something way more reasonable. And yet, Laban sets terms that are so insanely unreasonable. They are so high, so overshot. It's actually like insulting. It was actually essentially disrespectful to even set this as your opening negotiation. And yet Jacob accepts it. Again, he is impulsive and sometimes he does not think. Jacob agrees to work for 7 years for free for Laban in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage. Then Laban takes the grift even further because this is partly on Jacob. He accepted stupid terms. He didn't even try to negotiate, but he deceives him into making 7 years into 14 years by switching Leah out with Rachel. Why does Laban do this? Laban does it because he knows that as the wealthy, powerful, divinely blessed head of God's covenant people right now, his presence on Laban's land, in Laban's household, will potentially enrich his household more and more and more the longer and longer and longer he can keep him on the hook. The important thing we have to understand here is that Jacob, the manipulator, is now being manipulated. And so there's this almost like sort of series of like comedy bits. Laban switches Rachel out with Leah in the darkness. At that point in time, you would have the wedding ceremony. It would last often for days. Everybody would get insanely drunk, like sloppy drunk, like cannot see your hand in front of your face level drunk. And the bride and the groom, also just insanely drunk, would make their way into the tent. It was not like a little tent like when you go camping. It was, a dwelling structure, and they would go into the tent and they would consummate the marriage, but they would typically both be so drunk, and it would be the dead of night. There would be really no significant illumination, and often the bride would be veiled until after the consummation. Why? There's a long series of reasons, but basically it's a weird cultural quirk. And so Jacob is probably sloppy drunk. It is very dark. His bride is veiled. He doesn't know what's going on. Leah herself may or may not know what's going on. We have no idea if Leah was in on this at all. But basically, Laban switches Rachel out with Leah. Jacob consummates the relationship with Leah. Now, in the ancient Near Eastern culture, once you slept with someone, you were married to them. Basically, that was how you sealed the marital vow. Today we do things like we put a wedding ring on, we sign papers, other stuff like that. Someone says, I now pronounce you man and wife. They had things sort of similar to that. But the actual moment of your marriage was the consummation. That's one reason why, reading throughout the Old Testament law, frequently, basically, it's like, okay, if you sleep with this person, you have to pay her father the bride price, and then you are responsible for her the rest of your life, or the rest of her life, and so on and so forth. It's because in that culture, to sleep with someone was to marry them most of the time. And it kind of had to be that way because in the culture of the ancient Near East, once a woman had been slept with previously by another man, she was going to have a very, very hard time finding a husband today. They were obsessed with paternity. We've talked a little bit about this, but essentially, even though it makes no actual like biological or scientific sense, the way that people in the ancient Near East thought was that the only way you could ever be certain that all of the children in your family were yours is if you were the only man the mother had ever slept with. Again, once, 9 or 10 months have passed, doesn't make any difference that she has slept with somebody else. Any children she has now are definitely yours, but that's just kind of the way that they saw things at that point in. So now that Jacob has consummated the relationship with Leah, he cannot get rid of her. He is stuck with her forever, period. And that means that if he wants Rachel, he has to work another 7 years in order to get her. So this is evil on Laban's part, but it's brilliant. And it's honestly kind of hilarious. Jacob is getting exactly what he's dished out to people like Esau and Isaac and others, dished right back to him. Same thing happens. Laban says, the younger daughter cannot marry the younger daughter cannot marry before the older daughter. It's a custom here in our area. Now, this is something that Laban could have told Jacob 7 years ago. It might have changed things a little bit for Jacob, or he might have been willing to work for, 7 years, 14 years for both. Who knows? But Laban purposefully kept that from him as a way of getting 14 years out of him instead of 7 years, which is already an insane amount. But notice, this is very much like what Jacob did to Esau. When Jacob took the birthright and the blessing of his older brother, Esau. Jacob is the younger brother, and yet he's coming out over the older brother. Now, Jacob is being deceived and manipulated by being forced to marry the older sister before he can have the younger sister. So Laban is doing to Jacob very much what Jacob has done to others through the years. Essentially what's happening is that God is using this evil man, Laban, to show Jacob a dark mirror of himself. God is putting Jacob through the same kinds of deception and backstabbing that he put Isaac and Esau through. God is teaching Jacob about godliness versus ungodliness. He's putting Jacob through the ringer using Laban as a way of preparing him, shaping him into the covenant head that he needs to be for this next generation of God's people. And yet, Jacob's process of learning and growing is not linear, and it's not straightforward, and it's not simple. Does Jacob learn from all of this? Yeah, I think he absolutely does. Does Jacob change as a result of all of this? I absolutely think that he does. But that doesn't mean that Jacob just becomes a wise, mature, godly man overnight. And we see that in the fact that even as he is learning over here, we see Jacob repeating his father's own sin over here. We see Jacob bringing the favoritism that his father and his mother inflicted onto him and his brother Esau into his marriages, because Jacob clearly favors Rachel over Leah. And that makes sense. You can understand. Rachel is the one he wanted to marry. Leah is the one he was tricked into marrying. It's hard to get past that emotionally. That's true. But rather than treating his two wives justly, he visibly, unmistakably, clearly favors Rachel over Leah. And yet God does what he always does. God reveals his care for the forgotten. He reveals his care for the neglected. He reveals his love and his care for the people that our fallen and broken world, our society has decided are worthless. He shows he sees worth in them. He does that just like he did with Hagar, just like he did with Ishmael, just like he's done with so many others. He reveals his care for the forgotten and the neglected by making Leah, the neglected, unwanted wife, more fruitful than Rachel, the beloved, treasured, and frankly, idolized wife. Rachel is an idol for Jacob. She's going to continue to be an idol for Jacob throughout this entire story. Leah is just kind of ignored by Jacob, and yet the Lord clearly demonstrates his love for Leah and everyone like Leah by making her the fruitful one rather than Rachel. And this is important because in the ancient Near Eastern culture where all this is happening, the more fruitful wife was the one who had essentially the higher status. So Leah began as the lower status wife. She's the wife who is clearly less loved by her husband. She is the wife who is clearly less valued by her father. She is the wife who, she is not as beautiful. She is not as anything as Rachel. So clearly I had a friend in college. This is insane. This is genuinely nuts. Well, it's a whole thing. She grew up as part of the Gothard cult, and Bill Gothard, it's a cult, okay? It is. It's not good. It's bad. The Duggars were in a cult. It's a whole thing. We need to just accept reality here. But she grew up in the Gothard cult, and it was a whole bizarre thing. She had a bunch of stories about just weird crap that went down with Bill Gothard and him making all of his secretaries have this certain very distinct 1980s haircut because he had a fetish for that haircut, and it was wild. Yeah, I think she was writing a book about it called Former Cult Kid or something. So maybe that'll be out one day, and I can find stories for you from it. But when she was growing up, her parents specifically named her Leah because when she was born, they were like, oh, that's not a very pretty baby. And they referred to her as the smart one as she was growing up because her sister was, I guess, a lot better. I never met her sister. Was a lot better looking than her, I guess. And yeah, they said you're our Leah, she's our Rachel. You're the smart one, she's the pretty one. You're it's nuts. Parents can be nuts, man. And so Leah is beneath her sister in basically every way culturally at that time. And yet the fact that now she's the more fertile one, God has actually raised her status in this culture. He's raised her status above her sister. He's showing that although the world may ignore and just kind of neglect people like her, he does not. That is Genesis 29. But Genesis 29 rolls straight into Genesis 30. And as we trek into Genesis 30, what's going to happen is that all of the kind of ideas that have been rattling around Genesis 26, 27, 28, and 29 are going to come together and sort of pay off. Here's what I'm talking about. As we make our way into Genesis 30, the big picture essentially here is that every character here in the story has been trying to manipulate their way into God's blessing, just like the Tower of Babel. But they are forcibly shown again and again and again that they don't have to do that. God is freely giving his blessings by faith. And so essentially what's happening in Genesis 30 is it's showing us Jacob has not internalized the vision God gave him of this ladder to heaven yet. Leah has not internalized this vision of the ladder to heaven. Rachel has not internalized this vision of the ladder to heaven. Laban, sure as heck, has not internalized this vision of the ladder to heaven yet. Instead, they are all still living basically like Babel rather than living like God's covenant people. And we see this in a handful of ways. The most obvious example is the kind of divine irony. So Esau demonstrated just how little care he had for God's covenant and mission by constantly taking these pagan wives from the surrounding Hittite tribes and so on and so forth. And yet early on in Jacob's marital life, he has actively left the promised land, gone back to the land of his kin to find a wife from Abraham's bloodline so that he will have a wife or multiple who have some degree of foundation in worship of the true God. And yet Jacob's marital life right now doesn't really function much different from Esau's pagan marriages. Jacob's family is in shambles. It is splintered. It is filled with strife and everything else in ways that it absolutely should not be. And it is entirely because of Jacob. So you can get the Jacob away from Esau, but you've also got to get the Esau out of Jacob. In the same way, we see Jacob repeating once again the kind of wavering faith of Abraham when he takes Rachel's handmaiden as a surrogate for children. Rachel can't have any children up to this point, and so he takes her handmaiden so that he can have a child through her. This is like what happened with Sarah and Hagar. And like we talked about before, the ancient Near East, this is considered a legitimate heir. This is considered a legitimate child of Rachel. Legally, any children who are had via surrogacy through a handmaiden is considered Rachel's flesh and blood, just kind of in a legal and cultural sense, even though it's not biologically that way. And then when that works well, Leah says, well, here, why don't you do the same thing with my handmaiden? Rachel and Leah are competing with each other. Yes, they're competing with each other for Jacob's love, absolutely, but Jacob's love is kind of part of their cultural status at this point in time. So they're also sort of competing with each other for status. Jacob's love is sort of wrapped up in cultural power. They're competing with each other for power and all these different things. So once again, they are seeking the blessings of the Lord through human force, human will, human manipulation, rather than just allowing the chips to fall where they do, trusting him to work everything together for their good. It escalates even more. Rachel and Leah actively start to use mandrake roots as a way of competing with each other reproductively. Now, mandrake roots, they were used very often in like pagan fertility rituals. So essentially they're using pagan fertility rituals to try to increase their ability to have children in this sort of competition. So now, not only are they not just trusting the Lord to work all of this together for their good, they are actively seeking out kind of pagan remedies to their problem. This is very much like Jacob and Rebekah using ungodly means, pursuing a godly goal. It's good to want more children. It is good to want to increase the size of their family, their tent, and so on and so forth. It's good to want to be treated with dignity, and yet they are seeking those things through ungodly, faithless means. And so Genesis 30, once again, the punchline is actively comedic. This is meant to be comedic. They go through all of this and it does practically nothing to help them. Everything stays exactly the same. The status quo just continues. Things are just as bad as they've always been for both of them. Only after all of their schemes have failed completely, borne no fruit, and they finally give up. Only then God enables Rachel to conceive herself. She has her own biological child. God actively withholds the blessing that they're looking for so long as they are pursuing that blessing through human power, human will, human manipulation. Only after they give up does he say, okay, now I'm going to freely give you these blessings you've been looking for, purely by grace. And that same exact thing is happening with Jacob. Laban manages to manipulate Jacob into staying even longer. The 14-year term passes, and then he just keeps on staying there. He keeps working for Laban. Jacob's getting practically nothing out of it. It's a bad deal for Jacob. And so he's ready to leave, but finally, Laban manipulates Jacob. He uses a kind of deceptive breeding arrangement with the livestock. He basically tells Jacob, okay, you pick which livestock you want, and all of the children of those livestock you can have. They'll be considered yours. Any increase in the flocks, any increase in the crops, any increase in everything from the ones that you select, those are going to belong to you and will benefit your household, not my household. But then he has his farm hands come and they go and they sort of deceptively remove most of the one that Jacob chose. So that Jacob is starting out with this tiny, minuscule. The amount that he lists out there, you can't really do anything with that few. But what happens? God makes these minuscule herds that belong to Jacob vastly more fertile than Laban's animals. And he does this despite the fact that Jacob is using really unscientific and frankly stupid methods to try to make them more fertile. This is meant to be funny. Again, this is not one of those things where they're describing some old pseudoscience that people used to believe, but now, we know it doesn't work. They're describing these things. Jacob had them chew these certain plants. Jacob placed them in certain spots and other stuff like that. He's using old superstitions that by the time you are reading Genesis, by the time the original audiences were reading Genesis, they already regarded these things Jacob is doing with the flocks as old, stupid superstitions. So Genesis 30 is literally saying Jacob did a bunch of old, stupid, superstitious stuff to try to get the upper hand. And they didn't do anything, but God freely blessed Jacob's flocks, and he made them vastly more fertile than Laban's. Jacob cannot beat Laban at his own game, but Yahweh absolutely can, and he does. God is demonstrating his power to do the impossible again, and yet Laban is taking exactly the wrong message from it. The message Laban takes from it is, Jacob is cheating me. Somehow Jacob is robbing me. Somehow Jacob is taking from me. No, Jacob is not taking from you. You, Laban, you pissed it away without realizing what you were doing. The Lord is giving what belonged to you to the covenant head to whom it now rightly belongs. Jacob did not have to do any of the deception, manipulation, any of it, because the Lord has been carrying him through all of these things from the very beginning. And he will carry him through absolutely everything all the way to the very end. That is Genesis 26 through 30. I know there's plenty of things that we didn't get to dive deep into that you may still have questions about. So put your questions in the comments of this YouTube video or in the Let's Read Scripture Together Facebook group, and I will tackle every one of your questions as soon as I get the chance. But between now and then, I love you guys. Take care and keep reading. Hey, what's up? It's Pastor Ryan from Mount Zion Baptist Church. I'm extremely glad that you watched our video, and I hope that the Lord used it to speak to you in a very powerful and specific way. Hit the like and subscribe buttons on this video so that you can keep up with everything that we put out and we come up a little bit higher in your algorithm, and send a personal message to our YouTube account. I would love to hear from you, get to know you, pray with you a little bit. Between now and then, take care.